In July of 1934, Key West, Florida, was bankrupt. More than $5 million in debt, 80% of its people on relief, average income under $7 a month. The city's elected government did what no other city government in the country had done. It signed the island over to Washington. The fortune that built Key West had been made 3 times, on shipwrecks, then on cigars, then on sponges, and by the summer of 1934, 3 times, it had been lost. Decades earlier, this same island had been called the richest city per capita in the United States, a claim repeated more often than it was ever proven. The distance between those two facts, richest and ruined, is the story of a city that sold what the sea brought in until the only thing left to sell was itself. Chapter 1. Bone Key. In 1815, the Spanish governor of Florida signed over a narrow coral island near the southern tip of the peninsula to Juan Pablo Salas, an artillery officer who had served the crown long enough to be owed a favor and modest enough in his asking to request land instead of money. The island had no name that Spain had bothered to record before that year. The Spanish called it Cayo Hueso, Bone Key, and the story goes, reported by the sailors who came after, never confirmed by anyone who was there first, that the name came from human bones found scattered along its beaches, the remains of some earlier battle or shipwreck nobody troubled to write down. Salas took the grant. For 6 years, by every surviving account, he did almost nothing with it. Havana, in December of 1821, was closer to Key West than any American city, a 2-day sail across open water, and it was in a cafe there that Salas finally found a use for his island. He offered it to John Simonton, an American businessman doing trade in Cuba. For a price the two men settled between themselves. Simonton did not buy blind. He crossed the strait, walked the scrub and the beaches, and judged what Salas apparently never had, that a coral outcrop with a deep natural harbor, sitting astride the shipping lane between the Gulf of Mexico and the Atlantic, was worth far more than an artillery officer's back pay. On January 19, 1822, Simonton closed the purchase. The price was $2,000, not for a lot, not for a plantation, but for an entire island, one of the great real estate bargains in American history. He would spend the rest of the decade convincing Washington the bargain was worth defending, that a speck of coral 4 miles by 2 was worth a naval garrison, a customs house, and the attention of Congress. The harbor did the convincing for him. It was one of the deepest natural anchorages on the Gulf side of Florida, close enough to Cuba to watch it, close enough to the reef to police it. In March of 1822, a Navy lieutenant named Matthew Perry sailed into that harbor and planted the American flag over Simonton's new purchase, a routine posting for a young officer with an unremarkable record so far. Perry would not be remembered for Key West. 3 decades later, he would sail a squadron of warships into Tokyo Bay and force open 2 centuries of Japanese isolation, and the same steady hand that raised a flag over an uninhabited coral island would end an empire's seclusion. In 1822, none of that had happened yet. He was simply a lieutenant, and the island was simply claimed. The following year, Commodore David Porter arrived with orders to do something about the pirates working the Caribbean out of Cuban coves, and he built his anti-piracy squadron, the Mosquito Fleet, around the island's harbor. Porter turned Key West into a naval station. He ran it for a stretch under martial law, no civilian court, no elected authority, a military governor answering only to the Navy Department. It was not a town. It was not yet a business. It was a forward base, and a forward base was what Key West, before it was anything else, had to be. Then, on March 3, 1825, Congress passed the Federal Wrecking Act, and buried inside that single piece of legislation was the mechanism that would make the island rich. Salvage taken from a wreck in American waters had to be landed by law at an American port of entry. The Florida Reef ran along one of the busiest shipping lanes in the hemisphere, a coral wall lying just beneath the surface, and it was claiming ships at a rate that would have ruined any insurer paying close attention. Nearly a wreck a week, year after year. By 1848, the customs collector at Key West counted 48 wrecks in a single year alone. There was exactly one port of entry within reach of that reef. Congress had, without naming it as such, handed a coral island a monopoly on other people's disasters. Chapter 2. Wreck Ashore. The system that turned shipwrecks into salaries was built on speed, and the town organized itself around that speed with real discipline. Lookout towers rose above the rooftops of Key West, one on nearly every substantial house, manned from first light by boys and old men whose only job was to watch the reef. When a hull struck coral, the cry went up from porch after porch, roof after roof, until the whole waterfront had it: wreck ashore. Every captain who could still float a sloop cut his lines and ran for open water. And the race was never really for the ship. It was for the paperwork that came with reaching it first. The captain who got there first became wrecking master, directed the salvage, and took the largest share before a second boat had cleared the harbor mouth. What came off the reef did not go to a warehouse. It went to court. Key West held a federal admiralty court, and every cargo pulled off the coral had to be landed there, inventoried, and auctioned under a judge's supervision. Silks, wine, furniture, cotton. It went on the block while the men who had risked a boat and a crew to save it watched their percentage get written into the record in front of them. In 1846 alone, the wreckers of Key West brought in goods worth $1.6 million, one hull at a time, one cargo at a time, one cry of wreck ashore at a time. None of it was piracy, and the distinction did real work. Wrecking required a license, a piece of paper no pirate ever carried. Wrecking required a court appearance every single time, cargo weighed and valued by a judge who had never set foot on the reef. Wrecking required a judge's award, ordinarily around a quarter of the value saved, no more, no matter how much danger the crew had run to save it. This was not looting. It was a licensed industry, taxed and supervised by the same government that had written the law creating it, and the island grew visibly rich on the difference. Captains' mansions rose along the high ground at the center of town, furnished with pianos, chandeliers, and mirrors that had been crated for houses on the mainland and never got there. The reef furnished Key West before Key West furnished itself. William Curry was a Bahamian-born boy who arrived in Key West in 1837, 16 years old, with nothing to his name but a willingness to work. He started as a clerk in a merchant store on the waterfront, keeping ledgers, learning in close detail how a cargo moved from the reef to the auction block to a profit. He worked his way up from that ledger, first trusted with more, then given a share, then given his name on the door of the business he had once only kept books for. By the time the wrecking fortunes turned into shipping lines and banks and real estate, Curry had turned with them. He was remembered, decades after, as Florida's first millionaire, the clerk who had out-accumulated the captains he once worked for. When Curry died in 1896, his estate was valued at $1.5 million, all of it traceable back to a merchant's ledger, and a 16-year-old with no capital but his attention to detail. Asa Tift built his fortune the other way, directly off the reef, and became the island's most successful individual wrecker. With that money, he raised a mansion of quarried limestone on Whitehead Street, set on the highest natural ground in Key West, 16 feet above the sea, that had made him rich and could, on the wrong night, still take a house back. It was built heavy, built to last, the kind of house a man builds when he intends his name to outlive him. Keep that house in mind. It returns to this story a century later, under someone else's name entirely. Chapter 3. The Cigar Capital. In 1831, an Englishman named William Wall, a castaway who had come ashore on the island and never left, opened Key West's first cigar factory. It was a small operation, tobacco rolled by hand in a wooden shed by a handful of workers, nothing that would have troubled the manufacturers of Havana if any of them had heard of it. Wall's factory was a seed, not an industry. 38 years passed before the seed became anything resembling a forest. And when it did, the man who planted the forest was running from the same government that had made Havana's cigar trade the wealthiest in the hemisphere. Vicente Martinez Ybor was a Spanish-born cigar manufacturer who had built his fortune in that Havana trade before his politics caught up with his ledger books. He had been funding the Cuban rebellion against Spanish colonial rule quietly for years. In 1869, Spanish authorities in Havana moved to arrest him, and Ybor left the city one step ahead of the warrant, crossing to the nearest American port he could reach. He arrived in Key West with his capital intact and his politics unchanged, and within months he had opened a new factory, El Príncipe de Gales, staffed with 500 fellow exiles who had made the same crossing for the same reason. Ybor was not alone for long. Dozens of manufacturers followed him across the strait in the years after, each one calculating that Havana was dangerous for a man with rebel sympathies, and Key West was not. The exiles brought their trade whole: the leaf, the molds, the rolling tables, the workers who already knew the work. By 1890, more than 80 factories were operating on an island that 15 years earlier had counted its wealth in shipwrecks, producing as many as 100 million hand-rolled cigars a year between them. Key West was, by that count, the cigar capital of America. The rollers who made that output possible earned $20 to $40 a week, among the best working wages anywhere in the country at the time. But the wage was not the only thing that set a Key West cigar factory apart. On a raised platform above the rolling tables sat a man called the lector. He read newspapers aloud. He read serialized novels aloud, chapter by chapter, day after day. He read speeches, when there were speeches worth reading, in a voice pitched to carry over a room where the only other sound was the rocking of blades and the soft compression of leaf into shape. Thousands of hands moved below him, rolling in the rhythm of a voice they had chosen and paid for out of their own wages. And for the length of a working day, the factory floor was also a classroom, a newsroom, and a theater. The factories were something else too, a treasury. Cuban independence was not funded from Havana, where it was illegal, or from Madrid, where it was despised. It was funded from a cigar floor across a narrow strait of water, where thousands of exiled workers rolled tobacco for wages and gave a portion of those wages back to the cause every month. In January of 1892, José Martí climbed to the balcony of the San Carlos Institute and spoke to a crowd of 5,000 gathered in the street below, the entire cigar economy of Key West standing still to listen. The workers who filled that crowd were sending tens of thousands of dollars a month toward an army that did not yet exist. A revolution in Key West was simply another thing the factories produced. It was, in its way, a fortune built on the same trade winds that had built the first one. Men and money moving across open water because the water made it possible. What the strait carried in, one step ahead of a warrant, the strait could carry out again just as fast, on a steamer, with no more warning than the first crossing had given. Chapter 4: The Largest City in Florida. The third fortune came from the sea floor. In 1849, the first shipment of sponges left Key West bound north, a modest cargo, and within 4 decades it had grown into an industry that made the island the sponge capital of the United States. The method required nothing larger than a small boat, and 2 or 3 men to crew it, a long wooden pole tipped with an iron hook, and a glass-bottom bucket pressed against the surface to cut the glare and show the shallow floor below. A sponger stood at the bow, reading the water for the dark, irregular shapes that meant a living sponge, drove the hook down when he found one, and twisted it free without ever putting a hand in the sea. It scaled the way the wrecking trade never could by simple addition. One more boat, one more crew, one more stretch of flat worked over. By the industry's peak, some 350 hook boats worked out of Key West, crewed by more than 1,000 spongers, landing roughly 2,000 tons of sponge a year. The catch in a good season was worth as much as $750,000, a third fortune stacked on the two the island had already made, wrecking behind it, cigars beside it, sponges now beneath it, drawn one at a time off a seafloor nobody had to buy. The three trades did not compete for the same hands. Wreckers worked the reef, rollers worked the factory floors, spongers worked the flats south and west of town, in boats that rarely left sight of land. The 1890 census recorded 18,080 people on the island, making Key West the largest city in Florida, bigger than Jacksonville, bigger than Tampa, bigger than Miami, which did not yet exist. It was the first city in the state to pass 10,000 residents, and by every contemporary account, the wealthiest one in it. A city reachable only by water, outproducing towns the railroads had already reached. Picture Duval Street on a Saturday evening in 1890. The lookout towers built for the wrecking trade still rise above the roof lines, their perches empty at this hour. The watchmen who once manned them gone into other work entirely. Lamplight spills from the cigar factories that run for blocks along the side streets. And where the windows are open, you can hear the lector's voice, carrying over the rocking of blades. One unbroken sentence stretched across 100 rolling tables. Spanish and English cross, in the street between the same buildings, sometimes in the same sentence, sometimes from the same mouth. Walk 2 blocks toward Whitehead Street and the register changes. Quieter here, heavier with money. Captain's mansions set back from the road with reef-salvaged pianos and chandeliers glinting behind windows never billed to anyone who lived to complain. The San Carlos Institute stands lit for a meeting, a lecture, a collection taken up for a war not yet won, doors open to whoever has 10 cents of a week's wages to give it. Down at the harbor, hook boats ride at anchor beside steamers loading cargo for northern ports, wood and iron sharing the same water. A town that had been a customs post and a graveyard of ships 70 years earlier now moves in 3 languages and 3 trades at once. Sitting on money it does not fully control. Above a reef it did not build, beside a strait it cannot close, over a sea floor it will not always own. 3 fortunes, and not one of them belonged to the island in any lasting sense. The reef was a hazard that could be charted, avoided, eventually tamed by lighthouses built to keep ships from finding it at all. The strait was a channel other harbors could reach by other means, whenever it suited them. The seafloor could be worked by hands that were not Key West's, in a boat rigged the same simple way, launched from a beach 100 miles up the coast. Every dollar the city had made came from something it merely happened to sit beside. Chapter 5. The Fire and the Exodus. The fire, in fact, came first. 4 years before the census would count Key West as the largest city in Florida, on the night of March 30th, 1886, it broke out in a coffee shop beside the San Carlos Institute and burned for 12 hours. By morning, it had taken roughly 50 acres of the city and more than a dozen cigar factories. And the damage came to some $2 million. Nobody ever recorded much more about the coffee shop than that it stood next door to something more important. There is a detail in the record that does more work than the fire itself. 5 months before the coffee shop caught, Vicente Martinez Ibor had already bought 40 acres of scrubland outside a small port on the other side of the Florida peninsula, near a town called Tampa. He had not bought it because he expected a fire. He had bought it because an island reachable only by water, with no rail line and no room left to expand, packed tight enough that one bad night could take a dozen buildings, had already stopped making sense to a man doing the arithmetic. The fire did not create Ibor's reason to leave. It only removed his reason to stay. What followed had the shape of a decision already made, waiting only for an occasion. Factory after factory closed its Key West doors in the months after the fire, its molds and rolling tables and, in some cases, its entire workforce carried down to the harbor and loaded onto steamers bound across the Gulf for Tampa Bay. Not all at once, not with any single announcement, not even, in most cases, with much regret recorded anywhere. What the Strait had carried in 17 years earlier, one step ahead of a Spanish warrant, the Strait now carried out again. The same steamer route reversed. No warrant required this time. By the time the ash had settled on Duval Street, the second fortune was already leaving the harbor. Then, just as quietly, the third fortune went the same direction. From 1905, a different kind of diver worked the sponge beds south of the Keys. Greek crews out of Tarpon Springs on Florida's Gulf Coast dove in sealed, hard hat suits and worked the sea floor directly instead of hooking blind from a boat above it. A single hard hat diver harvested, by some counts, 4 times what a Key West sponger could twist free with a pole and a glass-bottom bucket in the same hours. The math that had once favored the island now ran the other way. Key West did not give up the sponge beds without resistance. Rival crews clashed on the water through the years that followed, boats sabotaged. Territory contested the way men always contest a living that is shrinking under them. In 1914, a Key West mob set fire to 2 Greek schooners anchored in the harbor, and the message in it was not subtle. It changed nothing. By 1917, the sponge trade had moved north to Tarpon Springs, permanently and almost completely, and the hook boats that had once numbered in the hundreds worked a smaller sea for a smaller living. Of the 3 fortunes Key West had built for itself, 2 were gone within a single generation of each other. The cigars to Tampa, the sponges to Tarpon Springs, both decisions made somewhere else, for reasons that had little to do with the island itself. The wrecking trade, the oldest fortune of all, was not thriving either. Lighthouses now marked the reef that had once claimed a ship a week, and the wooden hulls that used to split open on the coral were being replaced year by year by steel ones built to survive exactly the kind of collision that had made Key West rich in the first place. None of it needed to be announced. A trade can become unprofitable long before anyone gets around to closing the books on it. Chapter 6. Flagler's Folly. By 1905, Henry Flagler was 75 years old, and he had already built one Florida, hotels in St. Augustine, a railroad running down the peninsula through towns that had not existed before his rail crews reached them, a coastline reorganized mile by mile around the assumption that wealthy northerners would pay to winter somewhere warm. He was a co-founder of Standard Oil, the company that had made him one of the richest men in the country before he ever laid a rail south of Jacksonville. Florida was not his first fortune. It was where he had decided to spend the first one building a second. Key West was the only piece of the peninsula his railroad had not reached, and it was not reachable by any ordinary means. Between the mainland and the island lay 128 miles of open water, key after key, channel after channel, with nothing under most of it but coral and current. In 1905, Flagler announced he would build across it anyway, an extension of the Florida East Coast Railway laid on trestles and viaducts, island to island, until the rail met the harbor at Key West itself. The press had a name for the plan within days. They called it Flagler's Folly, and they meant it as a joke about an old man's ambition. The construction took 7 years. At its peak, The project employed 4,000 workers, laying track and pouring concrete and driving pilings across water that had already claimed 3 centuries of ships before a single rail tie went down. The men lived where the work was, on barges and floating camps anchored in open water, because there was, in most places, no land to house them on. In October of 1906, a hurricane found one of those camps. It tore a floating dormitory called Houseboat Number 4 loose from its moorings and carried it into the Gulf Stream. At least 135 railroad workers died in the storm, not in the shallows near shore, but out past the reef, in a current that does not return what it takes. The work continued afterward. It always did. On January 22, 1912, Henry Flagler rode into Key West in his own private rail car. He was 82 years old by then and nearly blind, and the crowd waiting for him at the station numbered 10,000, with school children singing as the train came in. He could not see them, and he said as much to the men standing near him on the platform, that he could hear the children, but he could not see them. Then he said the rest of it, that now he could die happy, that his dream was fulfilled. 16 months later, he did die. The dream, by then, was already finished, and the railroad was already running. What it cost him is not settled with any precision. Estimates run from $27 million to $50 million, all of it his own money, spent on 128 miles of track that no engineer before him had thought buildable, and no accountant after him could fully reconcile. Not a bridge over a river, not a causeway over a bay, a railroad over the open Atlantic, connecting an island that had made and lost 2 fortunes to a mainland it had never needed before. Key West took the railroad as an answer. The wreckers were gone. The cigar rollers were gone to Tampa. The spongers were gone to Tarpon Springs. But the rail now ran straight into the heart of the island, carrying freight and passengers and, everyone assumed, whatever came after freight and passengers. Trade with Cuba, trade with Panama, trade with a wider world that had never before had a reason to stop at the end of the line. The city that had lost 2 fortunes believed, with real conviction, that Flagler had just handed it a third. Chapter 7. The End of the Line. The railroad that reached Key West in January of 1912 was built on a wager, and the wager did not pay. Flagler had bet that a rail line meeting deep water at the southern edge of the country would become the natural gateway for trade, funneled through a canal, then under construction, across the Isthmus of Panama. The canal opened in 1914. The freight it carried went to ports with more capacity and less open water between them and the mainland, and none of it needed to detour through a coral island at the end of 128 miles of track. Key West had its railroad now. What it did not have, and had never had, was anywhere for that railroad to go except back the way it came. A railcar ferry did run the 90 miles to Havana, hauling machinery south and returning with pineapples packed in the same holds, and for over a decade it was the one piece of the promised Cuba trade that actually materialized. It was modest, but it was real. A ferry doing quietly what an ocean of speculation had once imagined for the whole island. Then, in 1929, a cheaper service began operating out of New Orleans, a shorter crossing to Havana's own harbor that skipped the rail yard, the transfer, and the delay entirely. The Key West ferry could not compete with a boat that removed a step the Key West route required. It kept running for a while longer. It had already stopped mattering. Everything else the island had built itself on was giving way in the same years, one pillar at a time. By the 1920s, the cigar industry that had once run 80 factories on the strength of 500 Cuban exiles had vanished into Tampa. The sponge fleet that had once counted 350 hook boats had vanished into Tarpon Springs. And in 1921, the Federal Wrecking Register, the license book of the trade that had built the island in the first place, vanished for good. No ceremony marked it. There was no fleet left that needed licensing, no reef traffic worth the paperwork, and the office that had issued the license simply stopped renewing it and stopped opening. The register closed 1 century, almost to the year, after John Symington had paid $2,000 for the whole island on the strength of what that same reef would bring in. The first fortune Key West ever made was, as of 1921, formally over, with nothing left to license. By 1932, the Navy, present on the island since Porter's Mosquito Fleet, and the one payroll that had outlasted wreckers, cigar rollers, and spongers alike, reduced its Key West station to maintenance status. The base stayed on the map. The jobs did not stay on the base. The census recorded what that meant in numbers that required no interpretation. 19,945 people had lived on the island in 1910. By 1930, the count was 12,831, nearly a third of the city gone in a single decade. In September of 1931, before the Navy's cutback had even taken effect, Flagler's own railroad, the marvel that was supposed to have made all of this unnecessary, entered receivership. By the spring of 1934, the city that had once been the wealthiest in Florida could not meet its payroll, could not service its debts, and could no longer function on its own as a city. Its elected government began preparing to do what no American city government had ever done. Chapter 8: The City That Sold Itself. On July 1, 1934, the Key West City Council and the County Commission did what no other municipal government in the country had ever formally done. They passed resolutions surrendering their own governing powers. The governor of Florida accepted the surrender and handed the island to the Federal Emergency Relief Administration, a Washington agency built to distribute checks, not to run cities. The debt behind the decision ran past $5 million, money the city could not raise, and no longer pretended it could. 80% of its roughly 12,000 residents were on relief. Monthly income per person had fallen under $7. National newspapers ran the story coast to coast. An American city had gone out of business. Enter Julius Stone, Jr., the federal relief administrator sent to decide what an out-of-business city was worth saving. He was 33 years old, a New Deal bureaucrat with no prior connection to Key West. He inherited the problem the way a receiver inherits a bankrupt company, with full authority and no obligation to be gentle about it. Stone weighed 3 options on paper, the way an accountant weighs them. Fund a $2.5 million relief program and keep paying it for years, evacuate the island outright, and relocate its 3,000 remaining families to the mainland, or gamble everything on a third idea and rebuild Key West, from the shoreline up, as a tourist resort. He described his own authority without much modesty. "With a scratch of my pen I started this work in Key West," he said, "and with a scratch of my pen I can stop it." His model was not vague. He wanted a tropical rival to Havana, to Nassau, to Bermuda, built out of a city that had nothing left to sell but its own climate. What Stone had, instead of money, was labor, and the island supplied it. 4,000 residents, nearly a third of the town, enrolled in the Key West Volunteer Corps and pledged 25 unpaid hours a week apiece to renovate the city they were living in. More than 2 million hours of donated labor went into it before the season ended. More than 200 houses came out of it, converted from private homes and empty shacks into guest houses. More than 60,000 postcards came out of it too, printed from murals that federal relief artists had been sent south to paint, images of an island paradise that did not, strictly speaking, exist yet. Residents raked beaches that had never needed raking, tore down shacks that had stood for decades, built cabanas, and planted palms along streets laid out for wreckers and cigar rollers, not for visitors. The city was, in the most literal sense available, remaking itself into its own advertisement. The winter season of 1934 and 1935 answered the gamble on its own terms. Hotel registrations rose 85% over the year before. By some counts, 40,000 visitors reached the island that season, arriving on the same railroad that had once been built to carry Panama Canal freight and now carried tourists instead. By the time the Tourist Bureau printed its first official map, attraction number 18 on it was a private home on Whitehead Street. It belonged to Ernest Hemingway, who had bought it in 1931 for $8,000. The limestone house on the highest ground in Key West, raised decades earlier by Asa Tift on his wrecking fortune, 3 fortunes and 1 bankruptcy ago. Hemingway wanted no part of what Stone was building. He wanted no tourists at his fence, said so loudly and often, and feuded with Stone in terms sharp enough that he put a thinly disguised version of the man into his novel To Have and Have Not. The house that had once stood for a fortune made off the reef now stood on the tourist map for a fortune made off the man who lived inside it. Key West had sold shipwrecks, then cigars, then sponges, and lost all 3. In 1934, on the instructions of a 33-year-old administrator with a scratch of a pen, it found a 4th industry, and this one it did not have to dig out of the sea or ship north to survive. The 4th industry was the city itself. Chapter 9. Labor Day. On September 2nd, 1935, Labor Day, the storm that came was not aimed at Key West at all. It crossed the upper Keys, well north of the city Julia Stone had spent a year rebuilding, and it did not so much strike the resort as strike the thing that connected the resort to everyone who might visit it. A Category 5 hurricane came ashore that afternoon with winds near 185 miles per hour and a barometric reading of 892 millibars, the lowest ever recorded in the United States to that date. Key West, at the southern tip of the chain, took wind and rain and little else, the murals still on the walls, the guest houses still standing. The center of the storm, the part that measured 892 millibars, passed over Islamorada, and the string of islands where the highway meant to finally connect Key West to the mainland by road, was still under construction. More than 400 people died in the Upper Keys that day. Among them were roughly 260 World War I veterans, men the federal relief bureaucracy had sent south to build that highway. The same New Deal machinery that had funded the murals, printed the postcards, and rebuilt the guest houses in Key West itself. They lived in camps strung along the rail line, temporary structures built for the work in front of them, not for a storm behind schedule. Warning reached the camps late. A rescue effort reached them later still. A train left Miami that afternoon, running south on Henry Flagler's own track to pull the work crews out ahead of the water. It reached Islamorada at 8:20 in the evening. The surge was already over the roadbed by then. It swept the baggage car off the rails. It swept the passenger cars off the rails. It swept the flat cars off the rails, the ones sent to carry the work crews to safety. Only the locomotive held its place, and the men who had been told to wait for the train went into the water with everything behind it. 40 miles of Flagler's railroad were destroyed that night. Trestle, railbed, and the work camps together, the same 40 miles that had once carried school children singing to meet an 82-year-old man who could hear them but could not see them. Ernest Hemingway reached the islands with the first relief boats out of Key West, ahead of the government's own response, and wrote of what he found there in an essay he titled, Who Murdered the Vets? The title did not ask a question. It named an accusation and left it standing, the one time in this story that anger, someone else's anger, is allowed to speak for itself. The railroad was already bankrupt before the hurricane. the storm only settled the arithmetic. Flagler had spent $27 to $50 million of his own money building the line across open water, 23 years before the storm took 40 miles of it in a single night. The company that inherited that debt did not spend a dollar rebuilding it. It sold the right-of-way and its bridges to the state of Florida for $640,000, plus the forgiveness of back taxes it had no way to pay regardless. $27 to $50 million to build it, $640,000 to be rid of it. In 1938, cars began crossing the same route the trains once had. The overseas highway opened on Flagler's old roadbed, a toll of $1 per car. The railroad had become a road. The road carried the tourists that Julius Stone had spent a bankrupt city's labor courting. The fourth industry, the city itself, had a highway now. Chapter 10. What Remains? The war did what none of the earlier remedies had managed. The Navy returned to Key West in 1940, and the base, reduced to maintenance status 8 years earlier, swelled to a wartime footing that at its peak carried 15,000 people through barracks and docks the island had not needed since Porter's mosquito fleet. The census, for the first time in a generation, moved in the right direction, not down, up. 12,927 people in 1940, 26,433 in 1950, 33,956 in 1960. The peak the island has never matched again. The payroll that had once been the last one standing was, for 2 decades, the only one that mattered. Peace did not send the island back to sleep. In November of 1946, an exhausted President Harry Truman arrived on doctor's orders to rest at the Commandant's quarters on the naval base, a modest 2-story house that acquired almost by accident the name the Little White House. He came back. Then he came back again. By the time his visits ended, he had spent 175 days there across 11 separate trips, running a country from a screened porch a few hundred feet from open water. Tennessee Williams settled a few blocks away on Duncan Street those same years. In October of 1962, the porch and the palm trees took on a different character. Anti-aircraft missile batteries dug into the sand at Smathers Beach. Armed guards stood watch on the 43 bridges of the highway. And Havana, 90 miles across, water the wreckers had once worked by sail, was now the enemy's harbor. And then, on April 23, 1982, the federal government handed Key West one more crisis to sell. The Border Patrol threw a roadblock across the single road connecting the island to the mainland, and traffic backed up for miles on a highway built over Flagler's old roadbed. At noon, Mayor Dennis Wardlow climbed onto a stage at Mallory Square and declared the independence of the Conch Republic. He declared war on the United States. He surrendered 1 minute later. He applied, on behalf of a nation that had existed for 60 seconds, for $1 billion in foreign aid. The roadblock came down within days. The Republic did not. Flags, passports, an Independence Festival every April. A federal inconvenience turned overnight into the fourth industry's newest product. The oldest industry on the island had one payment left to collect. On July 20th, 1985, a salvager named Mel Fisher found the wreck of the Nuestra Senora de Atocha, a Spanish galleon lost in a hurricane in 1622, its hold still carrying $450 million in gold, silver, and emeralds after 3.5 centuries on the seafloor. The Federal Wrecking Register had closed in 1921, the Admiralty Court gone even longer, but the sea still owed Key West a fortune, and it paid one last time. Exactly 10 years to the day after Fisher's own son Dirk had drowned searching for the same ship. Today, the island the federal government once weighed evacuating carries a median home price above $1 million. The population is 26,444. Fewer people than lived there in 1950, fewer than at the wartime peak of 33,956. A city that grew for war and never grew back for peace. Visitors spend roughly $3.5 billion a year across the Florida Keys, in rooms the Volunteer Corps once built by hand, on a highway paved over a dead railroad, on a sunset that costs nothing to watch and everything to live near. The bartenders and the deputies who serve them commute from the mainland each morning. Priced off the island, they spend their working hours selling. At Mallory Square this evening, as on every evening, the crowds gather along the seawall to watch the sun go down. They stand on the same stretch of harbor where the wrecking masters once kept lookout towers over every rooftop in town, scanning the horizon for the next hull to split on the reef. A juggler works one edge of the crowd. A conch shell sounds behind the vendors' carts. The sun drops below the water at its own pace, unhurried by the size of the audience, and when it finally goes, the crowd applauds. A nightly ritual in a city that once sold what the sea brought in and now sells the sea itself. The water keeps turning dark, the same water, the same island, waiting on tomorrow's tide.